Now that we've finished going through the cranial nerves, we can go through all these spinal nerves. Now, while the cranial nerves all were coming off of the brain itself, the spinal nerves are coming off and originating from each individual vertebrae all the way down. In total, there's 31 pairs of different spinal nerves. Now, the nerves themselves are coming off of each individual branch. So you can see some are highlighted here in yellow, the ones that have these plexi we'll get to. But even here, you can see the ones in gray are still coming off. Every single branch, each point there in between the vertebrae, has one of the spinal nerves coming off. It's basically supplying every part of our body, neck down. The only part that's not innervated from a spinal nerve is going to be our head. The head's covered by the cranial nerves. And every one of these nerves is mixed. Now, if you remember back to the spinal cord anatomy, we know that there was the dorsal and ventral roots. Those were specific, sensory and motor. But the spinal nerve itself, where those two join, which is what we're covering now, is mixed. So all 31 pairs of spinal nerves are mixed. You have 8 cervical. You're thinking, hold on. There's 7 cervical vertebrae. Yes, one comes above the first cervical vertebrae, and then every one after. So 8 cervical spinal nerves. You have 12 thoracic spinal nerves. You have 5 lumbar spinal nerves, 5 sacral spinal nerves, and if you notice, there is one coccygeal nerve. I didn't point out here because the very tip, very bottom, usually coming off. But in total, each segment has its own set of nerves. So it matches up with the vertebrae naming. So the spinal nerves, we know the roots. We already mentioned this back when we talked about the central nervous system. But you have both the dorsal and ventral roots that make up the spinal nerve. So right here we have the ventral roots. It's coming right off the spinal cord and will go into the spinal nerve right there. The ventral root, remember, is motor output. So motor output fibers coming from the spinal cord heading out. You then have the dorsal root, as mentioned. The dorsal root is right here. Dorsal root ganglion is this whole structure. But that is going to be all sensory information heading into the spinal cord, which means the dorsal root ganglion and the dorsal root are having information that came from the spinal nerve. This being the spinal nerve right here. So it's going from the spinal nerve into the dorsal root ganglion, dorsal root, into the dorsal horn, the spinal cord. While that ventral root was taking information from the ventral horn, leaving the spinal cord and going into the spinal nerve from the ventral root. So looking again, the roots are individual, sensory and motor, but the spinal nerve itself is mixed. But all these spinal nerves, they're short. I mean, if you remember seeing that picture, I was stuck on a little space because after that, they start to branch again. So the spinal nerves are very short. After that, you have these things called rami. Rami are going to be mixed. Now, you have what's called the dorsal ramus, and this one's pretty short because think behind the spinal cord, dorsal to that, how much space is there? A little bit of musculature, some skin, there's not much going on. So the dorsal ramus is relatively short. The ventral ramus is much larger because what's in front of or ventral to the spinal cord? Your entire body cavity and all the muscles and everything else. There's a lot more in front. So you have a larger ventral ramus. And then we have these things called rami communicans. The rami communicans are kind of unique because they're only found in the thoracic region. So they're isolated into that region based on the structure. They contain autonomic nerve fibers. Remember, autonomic, think automatic, just happens below your subconscious. So the autonomic nerve fibers. So here right now, you can kind of see the white ramus communicans is right here. And here are some gray rami communicans, that little branch. So it's just these little pieces that are kind of helping connect and bridge things together. The rami communicans. And dermatomes. Dermatomes, you can kind of see by this colorful chart, are the areas of each spinal nerve mapped to an area of your skin. So for example, if you look at the hand, you'll notice in the hand, it has C6 through C8. That's because what's happening here is you have different branches that go into each part. Depending on if you hit something up in your elbow or your shoulder, you might end up with some tingling or numbness only in 2 of the fingers, or in these 2, or the thumb. That's because they have different innervations going to each aspect of those. So your entire body, neck down, is mapped out to each one of the spinal nerves, or plural, spinal nerves also. Because some areas are only 1 spinal nerve, other ones might share 2 spinal nerves innervating the same spot. But that's also why it's kind of easier to figure out, okay, if sensations are in my leg or something's off. Well, you're not going to be looking at the cervical vertebrae and the cervical spinal nerves. Your leg, you're seeing our lumbar base. If it's the front, if it's the back, you might even get a little sacral if you're up more towards the gluteal region. It gives you an idea of where to look if there's nerve issues or nerve impediments. So the dermatomes, every inch of your skin, neck down, is mapped out to a particular spinal nerve. So a little bit about those initial parts of the spinal nerves as far as structure and where they're heading.